I am Ioannis Boukis. I work for the Ministry of Climate Crisis and Civil Protection of Greece. I am a Sendai national focal point, and I will moderate the discussion for the next 1.5 hours. A few words, introductory ones, on the overall framework. First of all, this Learning Lab is the first part of the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction Roadmap Action-oriented Dialogue, entitled Inclusive and Collaborative Systems for Heat and Wildfire Risks Governance. This is organized by the Government of Greece with the support of the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction Secretariat and United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction Office for Arab States. Over the day, the event will include 2 more technical sessions as well as 1 ministerial roundtable. Please note that this is the first time Greece hosts such an event at a ministerial level. As indicated in the EFDRR Roadmap 2021-30, to achieve a disaster-resilient European and Central Asian region by 2030, a broad understanding of the issues at stake is needed across the whole society, as well as further resources and investment facilitated by robust and inclusive governance models and decision-making processes. To this end, this action-oriented dialogue aims to gather a wide range of stakeholders. This action-oriented dialogue aims to address key questions with actors from Eastern Mediterranean countries at the highest political and technical levels, and enabling the exchange of knowledge and experience, whilst promoting the establishment of partnerships and the development of specific recommendations for adoption at a national and local level. This year again, several Mediterranean countries, including Greece, have witnessed a summer season with prolonged periods of extremely high temperatures and heat waves, resulting to devastating wildfires, where, according to the European Forest Fire Information System, the well-known EFIS, burn areas in Europe are 4 times larger than the average. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report states that the Mediterranean region is a climate change hotspot, and that warming across the region will be about 20% higher than the global average in the decades to come. The report warns that the region will be hit by even fiercer heat waves, droughts, and wildfires. At this point, allow me to share some hopefully interesting information related to today's event and the importance attributed to the climate change or climate crisis, as we call it now, agenda, at the highest political level. First, the newly founded Ministry for Climate Crisis and Civil Protection, our ministry, is the result of a political decision that acknowledges the clear link between climate crisis and disasters. At the same time, it clearly shows the need for a concrete response to the challenges ahead. Our ministry's dogma is the triptych prevention, preparedness, resilience. At this point, allow me to comment on prevention. We all think prevention is of utmost importance, but one must keep in mind, I think, that as a medium or long-term strategy, it doesn't bring direct results compared to the response. In other words, I'm sure that we all agree that it's a very useful planning, a very useful tool to have prevention measures, but this must not be detrimental to the response part. I assume that both must be part of a multi-level strategy. As we speak of prevention and resilience, I will jump to the European Forum for Disaster Risk Reduction that took place in November 2021 in Portugal. There, the member states, I remind you, symbolically signed the Matosinhos Prevention Pledge, committing to making disaster prevention and resilience a priority. In the same framework, ahead of UN Climate Change Conference 222, the well-known COP27, the Secretary General of the UN, Mr. Guterres, has underlined the importance of making climate action the top global priority. 7 days ago, October 13th, was the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, and this was dedicated to the early warning systems especially. So in this light, I hope the present discussion will act as a warning for the emerging risks as a result of the climate change. As a national Sendai focal point, allow me to remind you that the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which was compiled in 2015, contains references to the climate change, many. Namely, I pick some of them. It acknowledges that many disasters are exacerbated by climate change, that climate change is one of the drivers of disaster risk, that it is important to consider climate change and its impact on disaster risk, calling for adaptation to climate change, as well as for concrete policies and measures to tackle the issue, directly relating it to sustainable development. And returning to our learning lab, as regards the flow of discussion, each of the speakers will be given the word to share experience and thoughts on the subject, of course, in the field of expertise, and we're happy to receive questions. Then the speakers will be given the chance to interact with each other, hopefully having a very creative and interesting dialogue. And finally, we may get some questions, and I will do a wrap-up of the discussion of the event. So the aim is to communicate the importance of climate change scenarios and projections to a series of actors and decision makers. I am sure that everyone is willing to interact and that we will all respect the time frame in order to hear as many good voices and opinions as possible and keep a good flow of the discussion. Finally, the session is streamed through the UN and Ministry's YouTube channels. So a note for the virtual audience: if you are watching online and you wish to follow the discussion, the session, and you may participate through the Slido platform, you can simply go to the website Slido, and then you have to enter the meeting's password and then ask your question. And you may also vote up the good questions, the questions you think are good and need to be answered. So enough of talking from my side, enough with the introductory details. Allow me now to introduce and welcome the panelists. Dr. Konstantinos Kartalis, Professor of Climate Physics at the University of Athens, member of the Scientific Advisory Body of the EU on Climate Change. Welcome, Professor Kartalis. Dr. Wadid Erian, Senior Sustainable Development Goals and Disaster Risk Reduction Expert and member of Arab Science and Technology Advisory Group for Disaster Risk Reduction, co-writer of the Global Assessment Reports. Welcome, Professor Erian. Dr. Dominique Morvan, Professor, Head of the Mechanics Department at the University of Aix-Marseille. Welcome, Professor Morvan. Ms. Theodora Antonakaki, Director of Climate Change and Sustainability Center of the Bank of Greece. Welcome, Ms. Antonakaki. Since this is a learning lab and not a pure technical session involving only experts, I suggest we keep it simple, as this is addressed to non-specialists, and I include myself, of course, in order to understand the gravity of the situation. So to my understanding, this is not a seminar for experts, but rather a seminar from experts to non-experts. In other words, a learning opportunity for all of us. I will now stop talking and give the floor to our distinguished guests, asking each one of an introduction to his or her field of expertise through the prism of the lab's subject, kindly asking for their recommendations. Dr. Kartalis, Professor of Climate Physics at the University of Athens, will make a presentation on the context of the changing climate in the Mediterranean basin. Professor Kartalis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an extremely important event. I have to work out the architecture because I have a presentation. I have to be looking there. Maybe I will stand up if you don't mind.
Sure.
Well, I will present the context of climate change. With respect to the Mediterranean basin, a number of findings of the international scientific community in terms of the challenges and the obstacles which are in the Mediterranean. So I will start with a number of key points that have to be taken into consideration. In addition to the increase of temperature, which is well documented, we have changes in precipitation. Those are variable along the Mediterranean. In the majority of the parts of the Mediterranean, there are declining trends. In addition to this, droughts have become more frequent and more intensive in all parts of the Mediterranean, especially to the northern part. Heat waves have increased in the period of the last 20 years. And as a result of heat waves and droughts, we have now compound effects which make the forest fires more aggressive and destructive. With respect to the marine environment, sea surface temperature has increased. We will see that later on because it's a very important new development in the Mediterranean by about 0.44 centigrades per decade, and that's mostly to the eastern part of the Mediterranean. And along the figure that you see in the transparency, sea level has risen in the last century and also in the last 25 years by about 2.8 millimeters per year, and you can see that the majority of the sea level rise is again to the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So this is the starting point with respect to what we are facing now in the Mediterranean. These are facts, they are not estimates. Now, if we go to the next part, along with the findings, we have a number of new hazards. We have marine heat waves. We usually had just heat waves in the atmosphere. Now we have marine heat waves. And we also have compound events, meaning that we have two different hazards at the same time. And the impacts of the one intensify the impacts of the other. For instance, to have at the same time droughts and heat waves. And this is a new hazard that has to be taken into consideration. This transparency shows to the left a marine heat wave that happened this summer in the Mediterranean. The reddish color seems to reflect high temperatures on the sea surface. Whenever you have high temperatures above a specific level, you have more evaporation, more humidity in the air. This, in scientific terms, means more thermodynamic instability and means a lot of thunderstorms. And to the right, it's the series of thunderstorms, the so-called Derecho event, which happened in the middle part of the Mediterranean and distracted many parts of Corsica and southern France because of the marine heat wave. So there's a close correlation between marine heat waves on the one hand and extreme weather events on the other hand with destructive effects. The so-called compound event of the summer of 2022 in the whole area of Europe and the Mediterranean. To the left is the heat wave, which was a considerable burden for many countries. And to the right is the drought. You can see the correlation of the colors. The more the red the color, the more the impact. Again, this is a compound event, meaning that the impact of the one event intensifies the impact of the other and vice versa. A very critical issue to be taken on board. And there's a new climate change driver which I want to discuss with you. It's the change of the large-scale atmospheric circulation. And you can see that in the next graph. To the left, the yellow arrows is the jet stream. It controls the atmospheric circulation in the atmosphere and divides two parts of the planet in the northern hemisphere, the cold part and the warm part. To the right is the deviation of the direction, the change. And you can see the line that instead of being along the yellow one, it has developed a different shape. The shape is called omega effect, from the Greek letter omega of the alphabet. And what happens is that if you are in the summertime, if you're in the summertime here, you have a lot of heat waves, intensive heat waves. If you're in the wintertime, these parts, this part and this part, especially this one which brings to the south, polar air masses have snowstorms. And this is what happened in this country last year, in February 2022, an intensive snowstorm because exactly of this event, a change of the atmospheric circulation. What about climate models? Well, they have been more accurate. We have much more data, especially from satellite observations. We know better the feedback mechanisms of the climate model and the processes that control the stability in the atmosphere and the ground. We have improved grid size. We started with 100 to 100 kilometers, and now we have, through a number of downscaling techniques, statistical and dynamic, going to 12 to 12 kilometers and 4 to 4 kilometers. So things are getting better. We are much more confident about the projections of the climate models. So what do climate models say? They are getting better, but the results are not good. So what you see in this graph, and let's concentrate to the second column, it's the increase of temperature with respect to time in the 21st century. The first graph to the top is the near reference here, middle reference, and the end of the century. And this is the pessimistic scenario with respect to changes in the emissions of greenhouse gases, but still we can see the increase, which is quite significant in all parts of the Mediterranean. What is important to see is this specific transparency, where you can see that the only way to control temperature according to the Paris Agreement, that is less than 1.5 degrees centigrade, we need to have the so-called RCP 2.6, which is very optimistic. It cannot happen at the moment. It cannot happen with respect to the international efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. So we seem to be missing a challenge. If we look at the next graph, which is precipitation, the situation again is not good. We can see that there's a reduction again in the Mediterranean of precipitation going further into the century. That means as climate change advances more. And again, if we look at the same graph, in order to keep precipitation at the present level, we need to satisfy the scenario of 2.6 of the international community, which cannot be done because we cannot control the emissions of greenhouse gases. So things are not getting well. A number of findings, which I don't want to go very much in detail, but the first one to the left is with respect to sea level rise. There are new estimates saying that by 2050, the sea level rise of the Mediterranean will reach about 0.5 meters, half a meter, which is quite considerable, speaking about an area which devotes a lot of attention to the coastal zones. With respect to the coastal flood risks, that will be also an important aspect, an important burden, in the sense that 37% of the coastal areas of the Mediterranean are low-lying, which means that they are very much vulnerable to coastal floods. And what is mostly important as an aggregate conclusion is that coastal settlements, World Heritage Sites, coastal ones, and coastal ecosystems will experience longer-term risks from the sustained sea level rise. And this is an estimate of high confidence. We believe that this is going to be the case unless things are rectified. I want to go back to droughts. Drought is a very important hazard for the Mediterranean because it controls and influences water security and agriculture, meaning that it controls the development of the countries along the region and also social cohesion of the countryside. Again, the results show that there will be an increase of the droughts, of the duration of the droughts, and the frequency of the droughts in the Mediterranean, again going from the close period to the end of the period. And this is something to be taken into consideration if we also think about the heat waves. Now, all parameters in the Mediterranean that control forest fires have been deteriorating. We have increase of temperature. There are 4 parameters: increase of temperature, decrease of precipitation, especially the months before the summertime, intense and lasting heat waves, which practically what they do, they exhaust soil humidity. So all the parameters become more aggressive, and this results into aggressive and destructive forest fires. The Mediterranean is a climate hotspot. Mr. Buki said that before, and that's a fact. It's not the only part of the planet which is a hotspot, but still, the Mediterranean is a hotspot. So, what are the key messages with respect to this? Adaptation needs to be factored in high risk and take into consideration the new climate risks and hazards. The compound events, the marine heat waves, we have a new situation evolving. The second one is that there's a strong need for mapping of exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and then vulnerability. And this has to be done periodically, it has to be updated, and I see a strong support from UNDRR with respect to this. Adaptation needs to be differentiated by sector and area. There's no adaptation plan that fits in all cases. Whenever this has been tested, it was a disaster. No results were there with respect to the objective. Resilience of infrastructure, meaning ports, bridges, roads, buildings, has to be a major priority with respect to the intensity of the disasters to take place in the Mediterranean. Early warning systems need to be critical parts of adaptation plans. And then we have to modify the pathways for sustainable development because we have a new situation. We have new risks, and these risks have to be taken on board and modify the pathways for sustainable development. What is more important to my understanding is the fact that risks are more intense for developing countries and especially the poorer parts of the regions of those countries. That means that the vulnerability is mostly associated to the poor part of the population. And finally, to my reading, special focus has to be given to water security, agriculture, and to the urban areas in the Mediterranean. To be honest with you, I hate this presentation because it's full of negative findings and negative projections. But there's always a bright side, and the bright side is that if we give emphasis in the Mediterranean in order to develop proactive, long-term, and ambitious adaptation plans for increasing resilience to climate extremes. Yes, the Mediterranean is a climate hotspot, not the only one in the world, but still it is. Again, the bright side, if we manage to convert the Mediterranean to a climate hotspot for the best adaptation plans and practices for the future and for the benefit of the people. I really hope that COP27, in roughly 15 days in Egypt, along with a very rightful message to mitigate the emissions of greenhouse gases, will also give a very strong emphasis to adaptation plans, especially taking note of the new risks and hazards. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Professor Kartalis, for describing the problem and for your valuable observations. Well noted. We all acknowledge that extreme weather phenomena are the new normality for the wider area, and the bleak picture you drew as regards the climate projections for the imminent future calls for urgent and very specific adaptation plans, in other words, for a change to a more proactive mentality and behavior. Thank you. I will now open the floor to questions on Mr. Kartalis' presentation. I think it's a unique opportunity for all of us to learn directly from the experts. So, is anyone from the audience like to make a question? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Tasha. I'm a faculty at I'm also a postgraduate here, and I work in the National Coordination Centers of Operation and Crisis Management. From my experience, the most important thing, I work in the National Coordination Center the last 18 years, that have to do with climate change is time. Everything is happening so quickly, and we need time. So we need also to plan, as you already said, to adapt to climate change. But what are the most important things that we must do to earn time? Because time for us is very important, and we will not have the ability to have more in the future. So how we can earn time to adapt to climate change and manage better forest fires, for example?
Well, that's a very solid question, and I can say that time is not on our side, and we have to catch up with time by all means. Maybe the only way that we can do that, to earn time, is to trust the projections that are being developed by the international scientific community, and they are validated with high confidence, and act proactively. We don't have to wait for the event to happen. We don't have to wait for more compound events, for more marine heat waves, for more extreme weather events. We have to act proactively and take into consideration this will happen. Usually there's a tendency from the political system mostly to retard the decisions. Let's see what is going to happen. But that's going to be the problem. So we have to trust the models, trust the projections, and I can tell you that how can we trust something that is for 2040 and 2050? I know the consideration about it, but what we do when we run a climate model, we test it to the past. We use a 30-year period in the past from 1970 to 2000, and we apply the climate model. And if it's able enough to reproduce the climate of the past, then it's trustworthy to be used for projections in the future, with some changes, of course. So proactive character of measures is what is needed to earn time. There's no other way to earn time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kartalis. Along with climate physics, there is also the vital role of institutions and other dynamics that come to play. And this brings us to our next guest. I will now give the floor to Dr. Erian, who will speak, among other issues, on the role of intergovernmental institutions in managing vulnerability, as well as the drivers of risk. Am I right, Dr. Erian?
Yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
It was you, sorry.
And thank you for this presentation. It gives me an opening for what I'm going to say. Today I'm not wearing, I am just wearing one hat of the hats I have. So as a member of the UNDRR Advisory Board, I was involved in the last report, Drought, which published 21, as one of the 3 coordinators for the report. And from another side, I am a senior advisor for sustainable development at the League of Arab States. And I'm going to use part of this now in our discussion. I am a professor at Cairo University for land use planning. So let me talk not about sustainable development directly, but I'm going to talk about initiative we started already in the region. We call it climate security initiative. And why I choose that one to speak about? Because the structure of that report and the chapters I'm going to talk to you about is very important to what we are discussing today. In our first chapter, we are talking about modernizing our understanding for climate change. And just reading what happened last year, what happened during the summertime, from droughts, floods in many different places, we have to reread the story. In reality, most of the scenarios we know till now failed last year to give us a clear image about what's happening. And that's why we have to reread the scenarios. We have to understand better. And today, in the presentation I have just seen, let me tell you, 2 degrees increase in Mediterranean Sea temperature and also in Red Sea affected highly the changes of the amount of precipitation. It became like heavy precipitation in the south of Mediterranean with waves that reached 7 and 8 meters, giving a shape of tsunami to this region, which used to be dry and everyone is going to receive less rainfall during winter time. But not only, but also we have recognized that the subhumid is moving from the tropical area more to up to the north, and we are seeing now increase in flash floods in many places in our region and floods in many other regions, which means more droughts are happening in the tropical area, in the monsoon especially time. But we see also in the other side that we have seen in the report Land, which a special report has been published a few years ago by IPCC, that the percentage of the dry lands increased from 41% to 46%. Let me tell you, it's going to increase more, but let me tell you also that Southern Europe might be a subject to be a semi-arid area. And here we're talking about the adaptation, and this is very important. So rereading the scenarios is important for all of us. And rereading the scenarios is not only important for our region, it's important to reread the scenarios from Europe, Mediterranean, and Africa, because whatever happening in Africa will affect Europe. Whatever happening in Europe will affect our area. And we have to reread all the region totally and see the circles relationship in that part. So now we are working with WMO, we are working with World Bank, and UNDRR. We are going to draw a new scenarios, and I would like, maybe first recommendation here, that this scenario extend to cover Europe and Africa, because there is a need to understand better the situation. Second chapter is talking about the impacts. And talking about the impacts, and again, I will reflect to Europe, and then I'll come back to our region. In 2019, I was in Milano talking to experts of drought in Europe, and I said, you have to revisit your forests. Life forum within the forest is changing. Life forum within the rangelands is changing as well. And we have to reread this, because we are losing a very good source for economy, and we have to understand this. Uncertainty is increasing in agriculture in many places, and we have to understand where are we going with uncertainty, who are affected, the number of people who are going to be affected with uncertainty, especially in our region where there is a shift of rainfall more to the north. Summertime temperature is different than the winter temperature. In our region now, we are talking about 2.7 degrees during summertime. And this is different than the mean temperature, which we usually use as a figure. So we have to understand the changes in temperature during the different seasons, because this affects agriculture, this affects the industry, but also the melt of the ice and the river glacier in Europe is also a very important issue, because you have seen this year, it caused a drought on the rivers. And Europe, especially on the report of drought, we have mentioned that in just studying what is the definition of drought in Europe, we have seen that there is no agreement about a common definition on drought in Europe. This is by itself something we have to reconsider. So third chapter is talking about an important issue: who is going to achieve SDGs? I will tell you, all Arab countries are not going to achieve SDGs according to the agenda which we see now, especially with this decade. Last decade started with a lot of conflicts in our region, but this decade also started with Corona and now the Ukrainian war, and we are not sure about what is the economic crisis we are in and when it's going to, how it's going to extend. So we are not sure about the agenda of sustainable development, and for that reason, it is important to recognize and to see how to revisit the agenda and see how the implementation, the global, in Africa, especially also in our region. In the fourth chapter, we are talking about the triple nexus, and the triple nexus means that the countries affected by conflicts needs to peace building, development, and humanitarian. Those are the three main elements that we need to work through. And here I would like to tell you that this is very important, not only for our region. This is unique globally. We started with a report with human security, and we are using this triple nexus, and we might need this triple nexus in some places which we assume conflict in different levels is going to take place. And here, neighboring countries to Europe should be recognized as a potential areas sometimes for triple nexus learning lesson. So this is again in the fourth chapter which we are dealing about. The fifth chapter is very interesting because whatever development we are looking for, we can't achieve without having financial resources. And when we asked the international finance institutions, why you don't invest in our regions? They said, your region in all our metrics are in red, in orange, or in yellow colors. So investment here is risky, high risky. So the question to us, how to reduce the risk? And what should we do to reduce the risk? Because if we read the ratio published by UNDP about the investment in the globe, it is $2 per person in areas affected by conflicts, $10 per person in fragile countries, and 160 in stable countries, developed countries. This is not fair because to improve it, in reality, we need to revisit and rebuild what we call financial alliance with donors, with IFIs, and try to understand how to reduce the gap and reduce the risk which we see. So chapter 4 for us is partnership and building alliance for development in our region. The fifth chapter is partnership. The sixth chapter is about partnership. It's talking about how we manage to create several programs in different elements. I talked about the scenarios. I talked about the triple nexus. I talked about climate security. I talked about a digital platform for multi-stakeholders to involve them in all the dialogues, because this is something we are missing most of the time. We are just talking to governments sometimes. So the question here, how to build a digital platform that can really support all this. So our chapter 6 is about linking the financial alliance with development alliance. And by chapter 6, I just explained what is inside the report. And by recommendations, to just conclude, I would like to say what we're really looking for is more in-depth cooperation between the different regions in building scenarios, in exchanging of experiences in monitoring and early warning, in transferring technology and learning from each other in adaptation, because we have been a subject for drought and heat for a long time, and we produce a lot of seeds in that direction, and we learned a lot from the area we are living in dry lands. And I believe now maybe sometimes there is a window to transfer technology and transfer experiences and exchange it between the different seasons. And by that, I would like to end my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rian. The regional aspect is of utmost importance and a helpful transition from the general aspect to the local one. I will now open the floor to any questions on Dr. Rian's speech. So if anyone from the audience would like to comment or make a question. No? So I'll check if we have something from Slido. Yes, I'm getting a question from Slido from Mr. Rian. It says, Dr. Rian, I'm reading, you showed us that the boundaries between states and regions are artificial and arbitrary. Do you have ideas for how to ensure collaboration on issues of common concern from Africa across the Mediterranean and into the Middle East and Europe? That's the question.
So I was just talking about this now, and I would like to tell you the alliance we are building now, including EU. So we have EU and most of the European agencies involved in what we are doing. It's including World Bank, it's including European Investment Bank, it's including major Islamic Bank, for instance, for development. The idea which we see is there is all the time window, as I said, to build a dialogue between us. And maybe we are in need to have a committee that meet regularly to discuss where are the areas that we should cooperate. Mobility from Africa to Europe will increase. And we need to help people to settle by supporting them to learn more about how to manage their water and lands. Needs for energy from Europe and Middle East is increasing. And we need to learn more how to transfer technology between us and to learn from the indigenous knowledge in other regions. And all the time, we are also learning from Europe, and we are trying to get experiences for how to use the technology better. In fact, in reality, and this is the most important sentence I would like to say, I am not afraid in the future that we are going to have food insecurity and water insecurity as a major issue that made in the past by drought cultural collapse. Because with technology we can solve this. But I am afraid that the infrastructure we have now and the institutions we have now is not ready to manage the changes we are facing now. And the example I can give you very shortly, city of London, for instance, during this drought period, couldn't manage the drought because the infrastructure was old. And this is happening in many cities, in many places. Infrastructure and institutions are the most important to recognize and give attention, and we have to build something between us to improve more to that direction. So this is maybe a key message, again, I would like to transfer, and thank you again for this question.
Thank you, Dr. Rian. When we speak of climate change, we tend to think of wildfires, floods, and heat waves. Dr. Morvan, professor of the Mechanics Department at the University of Aix-Marseille, will speak on how to adapt a firefighting strategy and related issues. Dr. Morvan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. As you know, the fire season this summer was very bad. The surface burning was multiplied by a factor 2 in August. And in euro. And in France, it was a factor 6. Climate change means hotter summer, so more droughts, but also hotter winters, which affect also the forest through insect infestation. So the tree mortality increase before the trees are more vulnerable. So more fire in more regions, more intense fire, which is very important because intense fire creates also fibrants, which is a very critical phenomena in wildland-urban interface. More destruction in the wildland-urban interface due to the fibrants. And the projection, for example, in terms of cost, if you look at California, there is, in 2003, the cost was estimated to $2 billion. And in 2018 is 15 billion. So we could expect this kind of increase of cost also in Europe. To propose some solution, we have to know better what is a wildfire, what is its characteristic parameter. So one is rate of spread, but I consider that the better parameter characterizing behavior of wildfire is Phi intensity. What is Phi intensity? Phi intensity is a power released by 1 meter of fire front, like this, so 1 meter. And if you consider, for example, Phi intensity of 30,000 kilowatt per meter, if you consider only 30 meter, we obtain a power equivalent to a nuclear power plant. So it means that effectively a wildfire is a very powerful phenomenon. And it is also an explanation why, in some situations, even aerial means are not efficient to extinguish this fire. This curve is an evolution for 2 scenarios of the evolution of the fire intensity as a function of time. And the red one could be the most frequent now. I mean that after, there is the first part is the development of the fire, and then at a certain time, the fire intensity exceeds the limit of efficiency of aerial means, which evaluated more or less to 10,000 kilowatt per meter. And if you want to refine, the problem is that this time is relatively short. It could be 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It is for this reason that, for example, in France, the strategy for firefighting is early detection and massive attack of new fire. The problem is that we can do that if the surface to survey is relatively small, but if there is an extension of the surface potentially affected by wildfire, it could be a problem for the future. As the fire intensity is proportional to the fuel load, if you want to reduce fire intensity, you have to reduce fuel load. We know that extreme meteorological conditions observed in Europe this summer could be the regular one in the near future. Several droughts, intense heat waves will be more frequent, and we must prepare our forest to these new climate conditions. And for the point of view of wildfire, if you look at here, this represents the Phi Triangle. Phi Triangle is a 3 parameter affecting the behavior of the fire. So there is the topography, the weather, and the fuel. And if you look at these 3 sides of the triangle, the only possibility to have an action is to reduce the fuel, because we support the topography. It is what it is. The weather condition, we know that it could be more bad in the future. So the only possibility is to reduce the fire intensity in the future could be the reduction of the fuel. How to reduce the fuel? At large scale, probably fire is the most interesting tool to reduce the fuel by doing some preset burning with in safe conditions. We can also build some fuel break to minimize the impact of a wildfire in some region. And also, the agriculture activity could constitute a good barrier for fire. So the introduction in some place of olive tree or of a vine, etc., could be a good solution. And to manage also the fuel break, you can use animals. So the pastoralism is also a good solution in many places. So, in conclusion, a partial conclusion is that tackling wildfire is mainly a management problem, not only a problem of firefighting. So, in conclusion, so we know that the fire season this summer was a very relative shock for the public associated to the impact of the reality of global warming. Even if the renewal of some materials, IL means, is necessary, with also a stronger European collaboration, it is effective this year, it cannot constitute the only response for the future. It is impossible to extinguish all fire in less than 10 or 20 minutes. For example, in the Gironde, in the southwest this summer, the firefighting operation was efficient up to 99%. I mean that for 600 ignitions, there's only five which escape. So this example illustrates well the limit of efficiency of this approach. The hazard of wildfire will not be solved only in reducing the source of ignition, because it's impossible to control everyone, but in understanding how fire ignition can cause a catastrophic event, and especially to maintain at low level fuel accumulation, especially in the wildland-urban interface. More action and budget must be committed to prevent, before the fire season, wildfire, fuel management, fire safety engineering, land use, agriculture, and also to help the development of agriculture ecotourism. More action is needed to prepare population as for seismic and flooding risk. To summarize, we have to learn to live with fire. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Morvan, for the extremely interesting information you just provided us. I really hope this will also sound as an alarm bell to all decision makers. And I found interesting the relationship described between fire intensity and the efficiency of aerial firefighting means. I also noted that you mentioned the need for a paradigm shift from response to prevention, and that's exactly what I was mentioning at the beginning of this session, which is the motto of our ministry to prevention, is one of the three pillars. And that saying that tackling wildfires is mainly a land management problem. This is also a very, very crucial point to my understanding. Thank you very much. The floor is now open for any questions, but if there are any, I would please make them as short as possible. And I would also like the answer to be as short as possible, because we have to manage the time issues too. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will be quickly. Thank you for your presentation. As a forester engineer also, I 100% agree what have been said. The only way to adapt our forest in climate change is by creating spaces. Spaces can be created either from forest management or with fire. We cannot continue to accumulate vegetation in our forest. We need to understand that our living ecosystems that are constantly evolving and changing. We had spaces from previous fires, like the fire we had this year in Dadia, in the southern part stop in the previous fire we had before, last year in the previous one. So we really need to do work in prevention and use fire as a tool for fire management and protect also our wildland urban interfaces. And this is where the RL means, I think it's important, because we need to save lives and properties, which are our priority. So thank you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
So, is there a question? Yes. Just wait for the microphone, please.
Hello, thank you for for this important information you shared with us. I would like to ask about what are the plans of maintaining biodiversity levels as in a good condition, while at the same time conducting land management.
As you know, the Mediterranean landscape in the past was maintained. The Mediterranean landscape was transformed for 2,000 and more years. So, and in the past, this landscape was more open as now, because more agriculture, more pastoralism, etc. So you speak about the use of Phi. Could be, I think, Phi generally prescient burning contribute to maintain also the biodiversity. I'm not a specialist, but I know that if you do nothing, the result is that the lands are more closed. The animals cannot be enter inside the shrubs, etc. For example, so it's not many landscape in Mediterranean, especially in Corsica in South France, must be maintained more open, and to achieve this objective, Phi, I think it's a good tool.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but since we are running out of time, I'm sorry to, but we can take questions.
During the break, you can
sorry.
speak during the break.
Yeah, you can put your question in Slido too, if you want, and we can take questions towards in the end of the session. Thank you. So, thank you, Professor Morvan. I will now pass the floor to Ms. Antonakaki, Director of Climate Change and Sustainability Center of the Bank of Greece, who will address the issue through the prism of cost and economic impact. Ms. Antonakaki, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Boukis. Thank you for the invitation to participate at today's event. I believe it's very crucial that we are all here today discussing action and the impact of inaction. A short disclaimer, my views today not necessarily represent the views of the Bank of Greece. I'm here to discuss our work on climate and sustainability. We started working on climate and sustainability back in 2009. The trigger for all this work started in 2007 with the Stern Review, a major review on the cost of climate change for the global economy. And the ambition back then was to address the issue for Greece. So it took us quite a few years to a big group of scientists, interdisciplinary teams, to study the impact of climate change for Greece, the environmental, the social, and the economic impact. This work has been based on a lot of sectoral studies and macroeconomic models. We put a price on the impact of climate change, a price which, by the numbers back in 2011, when we announced the numbers, was great, and we believe that it's even greater now. We are in the process of updating all this work. But the key message was not the actual cost. The key message was the cost the need for action, both in terms of mitigation, but especially adaptation. The studies found that we are looking at a 30% discount on the cost of climate change if we are to implement effective adaptation policies. And that has been our focus ever since. So ever since this first part of our work, we continued the effort on adaptation policy making. We have an ongoing collaboration with the Ministry of Environment and Energy and, of course, the newly established Ministry on Climate Crisis. And what we're trying to do is actually help address how do we plan for adaptation, what are the policies, what are the measures that need to be taken. In 2015, we also drafted the National Adaptation Strategy for Greece. The draft was under public consultation. It was with collaboration with the Ministry of Environment and Energy. And of course, the draft was concluded with the support of a big scientific team. And from there on, we are working on the implementation as well of adaptation policies. There is an 8-year program that is running at the moment on the monitoring of adaptation in Greece. And through this project, it's the Life IP Adaptive Greece. You can look it up online. It's a partnership of many stakeholders under the coordination of the Ministry of Environment and Energy, and of course with the collaboration with the ministry, with the newly established ministry as well, where we are looking at an update on the strategy for Greece. I'll take a step back and I would like to comment on why central banks are involved in this issue. When we started looking at it back in 2009, we were discussing on a totally different context. It was something very new for central banks to be involved in. By now, most central banks around the world are involved in climate and sustainability. In 2017, the NGFS was set up, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's very clear that climate change poses risks to financial stability, and this is the reason why central banks are also involved in the issues. Always, of course, within their mandates and the remits of their mandates, because central banks have a very specific mandate, and this, in most cases, the primary mandate relates to price stability. But of course, they do realize that this is an issue that they cannot be on the sidelines. They need to take an active role, and the NGFS is part of this effort. It's a coalition of the willing, and it's a coalition of the committed, as we now say, because in 2021, in the context of COP26, there was a big commitment by central banks to do more on climate and sustainability. Many central banks have already published work plans on how they're dealing with the issue. The ECB, the European Central Bank, has published a work plan as well, took climate and sustainability parameters into account at the recent strategy review in 2021, and reaffirmed the commitment to do more in 2022 with even more ambitious plans on the issues. It's very clear that the financial sector needs to push for the right direction and support the policies that need to be that we all need for sustainable development, for the sustainability goals, the SDGs, for tackling climate change, and for minimizing the impact of extreme weather events, of heat waves, of all the current challenges that the world is facing. it is very important what we're discussing today, modeling, scenarios, data. This is something that the financial sector definitely needs in order to advance its risk mitigation, because they need to study better what are the risks involved in investing, for example, and be able to mitigate those risks. So one of the things that is needed is definitely data. The other thing that is needed, and this is my, of course, again, personal opinion, is regulation on the issues. Clear messages from policymakers on where we are heading. We do realize that there are certain policies that are already delayed, and there goes again the argument about timing. We are going to get there at some point eventually, but maybe not in time. So we really need to push forward for policy making and proper regulation. We do see, for example, the current state with ESG investing, the environmental, social, and governance parameters that try to capture the investing framework. We do see there that we need to push forward for regulation. The environment is still unregulated, and unless we put a tag on what is green and what is not green, we will not be getting the full advantage of the financial sector moving in the right direction. So data and regulation, policy making. And it all, the problem is a very complex one. We have seen how current challenges have created a very complex environment of how to address it. And we need more than just communication. We need more than just coordination, which is not a shared goal. We need more than cooperation, which is the meaning of cooperating for a common goal. We need collaboration. We need shared creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Antonakaki, for your contribution and for providing your insight on the issue. If anyone wants to ask a question related to what Ms. Antonakaki just said and shared with us, now it's the time, but please make it a short one. Yes, please.
Hello, good morning. Vlatko Jovanovski, Disaster Preparedness and Prevention Initiative for Southeastern Europe. We all, I mean, in the region, we all want to have strategies, and we have risk assessment, and we have these coordination bodies. But as a representative of the financial sector, do you actually measure the return of investment in prevention? I think that we as disaster managers expect this from the financial sector to give us a certain number so that we can convince the politicians that, okay, prevention functions. So if you invest such and such, you will gain such and such. So do you, in Greece, or if you are aware in the region, there are ongoing efforts in calculating and measuring the return of investment in prevention?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent point. It comes down to today's theme of having data, having scenarios, and having concrete and plausible arguments to convince policymakers to move in the direction that we all want them to. So in this way, yes, indeed, we have already done some work, and I mentioned it at the beginning of my speech, that we have calculated adaptation measures to reduce the cost of climate impact by 30% in Greece. And of course, there's been some other more specific studies to discuss the benefit of adaptation policies and risk mitigation in different sectors. And another point I want to make based on your question is that we really need climate data to be translated into concrete cost options as well and policy options. so that we have a clear path for what we do. The financial sector needs a lot of translation of climate data. What does it mean? And there we, apart from the modeling and the climate projections, we also need the socioeconomic scenarios and scenarios of policy making. We need clear ways and an interpretation of all that means, and of course clear commitment of where we are heading and what sort of policies countries are taking to meet as well both the SDGs and the contributions that they have promised to make within the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Okay. So now I think it's have an intervention. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Thank you. So maybe just to introduce myself, my name is Almal Sayed, and I'm from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, Greece delegation. So my intervention is a bit generic, so not necessarily related to one of your interventions. As we all know, and was also briefly mentioned this morning and echoed in our recent IFRC OCHA report about extreme heat. Heat waves are becoming more deadly as we go. As the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, we also know that heat waves prey in inequalities. However, deaths from heat waves are, we don't see them as inevitable. And they can be reduced through better planning, awareness raising, enhanced data-driven and early warning systems. Here in Greece, we have been working closely with the city of Athens and its appointed chief heat officer, Dr. Lenio Mirvili. She will be, I think, a speaker in the next session. And they have developed a heat wave categorization system, which I think was recent. It's basically an impact-based forecast aimed at helping individuals and local actors better respond to the risks of heat wave. It is basically, we can see it just like category, like as in when we have a category 4 hurricane. I mean, that's in our disasters language, basically. As in category 4 hurricane result in certain evacuations, suspension of outdoor events, shelter requirements, etc. The Athens heat categorization system offers also a trigger for action. For us as Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, of course, we are exploring how these alerts can be used to trigger the deployment of our humanitarian response tools that we also use for other types of disasters and crises. But possibly, I think more importantly, the heat categorization system offers a tool for planning and thoughtful reflections around risk reduction, early warning, and awareness raising, so that most vulnerable people are protected before the risk becomes life-threatening. Generally, we know that older people, very young children, pregnant women, people with the pre-existing medical conditions are at higher risk of mortality during heat waves. We believe that a heat wave preparedness plan success depends on the stakeholder in identification and engagement, and that we need to ensure that we hear from those most impacted by heat and adapt our plans to be in line with their needs. So my question to the panel is actually recognizing this unique social and geographical dynamics of the heat emergencies. I'd love to hear from you a bit more about the importance of connecting local and civil societies' action with the national and regional preparedness and response plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Al Sayed from the Red Cross. Would someone from the panelists like to answer the question, please?
I was talking about the importance of engaging multi-stakeholders. And in reality, actions is not happening just in the whole country. It's happening affecting certain local communities. And most of the time, we are dealing with numbers. We are not dealing with human affected directly, understanding what's happening, how they have been affected clearly. This is the role of NGOs. This is the role of academia in the local communities to play. And I believe we have to work more in depth to collect data from the ground and work with the people on the local communities. This is what is COP27 about, working in local communities, working with people. And I believe whatever figures we have now, the frequency, the intensity is increasing. Before it was increasing every 20 years. Now it is increasing every 5 and 2 and 3 years. Before it was going for 1 or 2 years. Now it is going for 3 and 4 and 5 years. So we have to understand the severity of what we are talking about and how really this changes the livelihood in many of those local communities. So I agree 100% with the idea, working with local communities and encouraging NGOs and academia and others to work in local communities in more in depth for the data collection and also for understanding better how human beings are affected in their daily life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rian, for your answer. And I think Dr. Kartalis also wants to answer.
Yeah, I will go along to what you said and try to bring down to the situation, to the local situation, the heat waves, because I saw the graphs, it's the whole Mediterranean, but finally it's at the neighborhood scale and it's at the level of the people themselves. We did an experiment at the University of Athens with a colleague, Professor Sadamouris, and we selected 50 houses in part of Athens. Those houses were not insulated, they didn't have enough premises and technologies to reduce heat. They didn't have double glass windows, they didn't have insulation, so on and so forth. So there was a heat wave, and at the end of the heat wave, the temperature inside the house, in all of the houses, was about 37 degrees centigrade. And that's devastating for the people living in the house. And it goes without saying that the first victim of climate change is the poor population, those that cannot sustain a change and cannot provide any kind of support to their houses or to their premises with respect to technologies. And that's a very critical part for a local society, a local municipality to step in. Define the places where there have to be urban regeneration projects to reduce heat and also support projects for improving the quality of the houses in the different parts of a city. If that's not done at the level of the local, of the municipality, it's going to be very difficult to be done at the central government level. So there's a lot of space for things to be done by cities themselves.
Thank you, Professor Kartalis, for your answer. So after this first round of discussion, I propose that a way to bring more added value to our dialogue, and I would like to call our panelists to reflect and comment on each other's presentation in case you have some comments. I will start with Ms. Antonakaki, if you like. Based on what you said a few minutes ago, Ms. Antonakaki, how do issues of transboundary responsibility play into these challenges of managing the risks that are clearly imminent? And where do central banks, regional institutions, transboundary communities share values, and where is there a gap in all this? Can you answer?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Boukis. In answering that, I would in a way like to reflect on all presentations as well, on all the speeches that we've heard today. Professor Rian already spoke about collaboration. In a way, I also touched about the the complex issues that we're facing today and how we cannot stay only on communication, coordination, and cooperation. We have to move beyond and talk about shared creation. We've seen, with the last question, we also touched upon the issues of inequalities. As Professor Kartalis already mentioned, climate change is impacting most on the most vulnerable. And it's not only climate itself, but it's also climate change itself, but it's also policies, climate change policies that impact on the most vulnerable. The cost of carbon pricing. There are certain parts of the population that will have more means to adapt. In order to adapt on a personal level, you also need capital. For example, for an insulation, we heard about the houses and the homes and how they respond. So in a way, both climate change itself and policies to address it affect on the most vulnerable. We heard about forest fires. In one of the latest, on a stress test by the ECB on what the impact of climate change is for financial institutions, we've seen that there are boundaries in the impact on the way, national boundaries on how we map the impact of climate change. That means that there are policies in place on one state and not on the other one. This is very important. And of course, climate knows no borders. Climate change policies as well need to be coordinated so as to be able to be effective. We know about the carbon adjustment border tax for carbon. We need close collaboration there to manage those issues. And of course, multilateralism. We need the work of the United Nations and the other international fora to be well integrated from the global scale to the local scale. I believe that in the years to come, we will be, local communities will be asking for answers of how to address the issues that are coming to them. They're already here and they will be much more urgent. A few days ago, the G7 announced a new climate club, the intention to create a new climate club to move issues of coordination for those themes. I think we need to do more on that. We need to be more integrated, to work together better, and to share a common creation of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Antonakaki, for your contribution. It's sure that transparency issues are of the utmost importance, and I don't know if Professor Erian wants to make a comment on this.
Yes, of course. And I am not going to talk about the Middle East. I'm going to take Colorado River as an example, just to be far from what is happening politically in other places. In Colorado, the agreement for Colorado River started in 1944. And before the climate change and the drought and all. And the previous years we have seen there is a problems happening with the flow of water in Colorado River. And this year we have recognized that 40 million in Mexico are a subject for not receiving sufficient water to drink. So the question of agreements in shared water is very important to be recognized with climate change. We have to reread again this story. It is very critical, politically, story, but we have to reread it again, make sure that when we share water, we should share it with a complete understanding for how climate change is affecting the shared water. And not far from this, I talk about the Danube River. And in Europe, this year, And I can talk about a lot of rivers in many places. It's China and many other places. But I just gave Colorado, and then you can imagine what can happen in other shared rivers, and leave it for your intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Riani. I think we all understand what you insinuate. Would Mr. Kartalis or Mr. Morvan like to say a word on this?
Yes. I think the main problem to do some decision concerning global warming is that political government must manage between problems of the end of the month and problems of the end of century. And for example, this actually with the crisis, with the energy crisis, they have to support economically, for example, carbon energy to help people, but it is in contradiction with the global warming objective, reducing the. So it is one of the main difficulty because each crisis push global warming problem on the back because they want to solve the problem of today and not the problem in 10, 20, that many people does not, they have some feelings that there is a problem, but they have to solve also the problem of now, the end of the month.
So maybe they consider such considerations a luxury, or, yeah, probably. Yes.
It's my turn, I guess.
Yes.
Okay.
Please.
Well, yes, I will go along to what was said before by the other speakers about transboundary and intergovernmental cooperation. I think the most critical issue is commitment. We have an inflation of promises. If somebody checks what was decided or what was announced in Glasgow 1 year ago and sees what happened in the course of the year, the progress has been very, very much limited. Of course, there has been an energy crisis, of course there has been a war, but still, the commitment is not there. And this is a very important message for COP27, which is the COP of Africa, to develop a momentum for the modification of the way that decisions are being taken, that commitment is going to be on the table along with the promises. And this is very important. Otherwise, whatever we say about transboundary cooperation, about cooperation of the governments, is not going to be the case. And we need to also support the multilateral organizations. United Nations, for instance, has to be given a lot of attention and a lot of support because it's the only platform that all countries, dependless the size and the population, can have a voice. And we have to capture the lack of progress which happened in the past because one major country, United States, left the United Nations system with respect to climate change. Now presumably they're back, but we have to catch up with time. So time is not a friend, it's an enemy with respect to this case, and it needs commitments on the promises.
Thank you, Dr. Kartalis. And with that said, I think that we now have reached the end of the evidence-based learning lab dedicated to climate change scenarios and projections in the Mediterranean basin, which is the first out of 3 sessions that will take place today. Those who have registered may as well attend one of the 2 following sessions of the Action-oriented Dialogue that will follow at 11 o'clock, namely the technical session Bridging the Gap Between National and Local Resilience Policies and the Leave No One Behind Dialogue, entitled Addressing Urban Heat Vulnerability, Hearing Vulnerable and Experienced Voices. Today's discussion between prominent scientists and researchers revealed in the most official way a bleak picture. A picture that is not, however, an alibi for inaction. On the contrary, it is a call for concrete measures to ensure the resilience of our societies. There is no doubt that the climate crisis will worsen drastically over time, and therefore time is of the essence. We need to act and act now. At this point, we all agree that we don't need just knowledge. It is true that knowledge has been expanding both in quantity and quality, but again, we all still agree that the action taken is simply not enough. So, to my understanding at least, knowledge is not an end in itself, but a prerequisite and driving force for action and change. A starting point that is imperative to take the form of specific policies. And I do believe that this learning lab is a small step in this direction. I would like to thank Professor Katalis, Professor Erian, Professor Morvan, and Ms. Antonakaki for their time and insights. I would also like to thank Mr. Petrov, National Coordinator for Disaster Risk Reduction, North Macedonia, who will wrap up the most important recommendation of this session in a clear and coherent way and deliver it to the Ministerial Roundtable this afternoon, presenting the ideas expressed in this panel. I would also like to thank the audience online and in person and those who actively participated in the discussion. I really hope this lab was an interesting and at the same time educational experience for all of us. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again and have a very nice day.
So I